prophetic timing was very important. And the reason I want to talk about prophetic timing is I believe from God's standpoint, from the throne room, I think He wants to make sure that there's clarity when it comes to prophetic timing. I think prophets need to be encouraged because oftentimes when it comes to timing, just like Jonah who went up to the place of Nineveh and he said, hey, look, man, in 40 days, Nineveh is going to be wiped out. And of course, his timing was off and so forth. But also I think we owe it to the people who are trusting that we are carrying the word of the Lord in our mouth. And I think especially with the measure of attack, the viciousness from the spirit of Jezebel that has operated through the media, has operated through some preachers, some ministries, some Christians, and really just some people to try to shut the mouths of the prophets. I think we owe it to the people who somehow are just caught in the middle. They're just saying, hey, look, we just want truth. We want to know what God is saying. We have some questions. And I think in the prophetic, and especially as mature prophets, we should never avoid accountability. Now, Steve, there's accountability movements. People who say, well, we're going to sign a petition and you're accountable to us and you have to do it this way. Well, you can't demand that. My office that Jesus gave me does not necessarily mean that I subject it to you in authority, but every prophetic minister must remember a principle that Jesus taught us in His first miracle, and that is when it was the water that was turned into wine, He submitted it. So we need to have someone or something that's legitimate that we can submit our gifting to or the supernatural flow of God. In this case, in my life, it's the prophetic. And He submitted it to the governor of the feast. Every one of us has to have somebody that is an authority figure. I have authority figures. I have fathers of the faith that I run things by. They can speak into my life. As well as, they can say, hey, Hank, that's not a good idea. But accountability isn't just for the basis of holding you accountable so that you don't miss it. Accountability also is to encourage you. I have fathers in my faith that say, Hank, keep going, keep saying what you're saying. And these are reputable male and female ministries and ministers that are generals in the faith that have proven track records. I'm surrounded with them. Also, the feast, where are you getting fed? You need to, I think it's helpful for people, if possible, that they have a pastor. It keeps you grounded. It's one of the greatest things God did for me is He had me pastor a church. And I pastor a very good-sized church here in Omaha, Nebraska that we started from scratch. And it grounds me because it doesn't just keep me in my prophetic office. It forces me to look through the eyes of the sheep as a pastor. What are they thinking when prophetic words come or they don't happen or it doesn't look like it's happening? So there's that we owe the people. Now let's talk about prophetic timing because this is something that really is on the heart of God. I like what Kat Kerr says. And, she's an amazing woman of God. And I love her very dearly. She's family to me. But, one thing that she learned from heaven, which is so important, is Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is a scripture that supports what she saw in heaven. And that was this, that the Father is not held by our calendar. He's not held by our timing. And so sometimes as prophets, when we see something or we hear something, we are trying to process what God is not only saying, but how and when He's going to do something. And sometimes God will say, in the winter or in June. Now, I gave a word last year, way before the winter season, that we would have a strange winter of snow in unusual places in the world. We would see snow, it said Texas, in the south, Louisiana. And this was like 5 months before the winter season. And it was specific. It said, this winter. So I am held accountable to the fathers of the faith, to God who gave me the office, Jesus did, that I stand in prophetically, that word then needed to line up, okay? And there's times, though, that I have prophesied and I said, hey, January, there shall be this. February, there shall be this. And if it didn't say this January, this February, then the prophet cannot be held to that time frame, because I've had it where I prophesied in the month of January, and here it is September. People think, okay, well, it's going to be that January. And I've found out that what I prophesied in that January didn't happen, and then people wrote it and they said, well, whoa, where's that came to pass? And then the next year in January, the very word came to pass. So we have to be careful when it comes to timing, that unless it specifically says a specific thing, this January, this February, or this August, whatever, then we need to let the prophecy play out, okay? You know, we mentioned Kim Clement ahead of the broadcast for just a few minutes that we're visiting as we're going kind of through all the technical stuff. And you said something so profound that, you know, some folks wrote Kim off, didn't even think he was legitimate until now that he's in heaven, and we're rejoicing over his words and seeing, you know, they're like, oh, he's a true prophet. Well, you called him false before, you know, when he was alive. And unfortunately, that's how we treat the prophetic, is we don't often appreciate the vessel, and we don't often appreciate the word until after they're gone, or until the word comes to pass. And then we always, when it comes to timing, we have to be careful that we don't put our timing on it. I have more people misinterpret prophecy because they put their interpretation on it. They put their timing on it because they hear January. And they think, oh, okay, well, that must mean this January. Unless it specifically says so, then you need to let that prophecy breathe. And I think something that is wise for every prophetic minister, unless you really feel something from the Lord about a specific time frame, you need to refrain from doing so. Otherwise, it can create confusion, and the people do deserve better. And I'm not just talking about other ministers. I'm holding myself to the same place as every other prophetic vessel. Okay? We're not in this to be about ourselves, at least we shouldn't be, and we shouldn't be in it to not honestly answer hard questions, because God needs it. Because when you're talking about prophecy, Steve, and this is what people don't realize, when John the Beloved was caught up in the book of Revelation, it wasn't so much about the prophecies that he was given, because Revelation 4 says this, and this is what prophecy is. Prophecy deals with the past, it deals with the present, but it also reveals the future, because Revelation 4 says, come up higher, I'm going to show you things that was, that's the past, things that is, that's the present, and things that are to still come, which is timing involved. And so that's how prophecy is dealt with. But when the Apostle John was caught up, he wasn't even concerned about that once he saw the one seated on the throne.
Oh, good.
That was his focus. And let me tell you, younger prophets, don't make it so much about your words. Because if you're not careful, and this is something that my good friend Bishop Harry Jackson said to me before he went to heaven. He said, we got to be careful that we don't become the spiritual ambulance for the body of Christ. Whenever there's an earthquake, a volcano, some kind of crisis, some kind of world event, that we're automatically coming to the prophets. What is God saying? As He spoke to you about this, and we have to be the ambulance. We have to be the answer, the emergency for every crisis. If you do that, young prophet, you will get yourself in trouble with God, because you will prophesy according to the demands of the people and not by the one seated on the throne. And you will become inaccurate eventually. Because what we're seeing right now, Stephen, I just want to say this. God said something to me today in prayer, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand me, okay? Because there is the Jezebel assignment that wants to shut the mouths of the prophets. We've seen it through the media. We've seen it through ministers and different ones, as I said. But God said to me, and I wrote it down, He said, prophets at this time need to speak less. Otherwise, if we keep on speaking and prophesying, and there's things that we're saying that, you know, it's just not heaven, or it needs to be held on to. One of the things that the prophets had to learn in the Old Testament that New Testament prophets don't often do is hold on to the word of the Lord. I personally, this is my personal conviction, I speak not everything that I hear. I hear more than what I speak. And that's the truth. God shows me things, and very few things that He shows me that I write down in my private journal do I speak publicly.
How do you know which ones you're to speak, Hank? How do you know which ones you're supposed to speak?
There's two ways that I do it, because again, prophecy, if you always know this, if you make this your focus, the one seated on the throne, my main goal is not to release a prophetic word or be the first one in the earth to release it. And that gets on prophets. Jesus said about John the Baptist, it's the only office he said this about. He said to the people, what did you come out to see? A prophet? John the Baptist more than a prophet. He didn't say that about any other office. So there's a performance temptation that comes on the prophets. We'll talk about that here. Where prophets feel like they have to be the spiritual ambulance. Or prophets feel like they have to be the first one that releases the word. It's pride. And that's why I don't anymore list out bullet points of what I see coming over the year. Not very often, because I'm not called to prediction. That's psychic. I'm called to reveal the heart of God, and I have to learn as a prophet. Don't get into performance. It isn't about me coming with the latest word. It isn't about me coming and having something so that, my prophetic office is the first one that prophesied this. If you're like that, you're going to get off in your grace. You have to protect the heart of God. That's the greatest responsibility as a prophet or someone who wants to prophesy. Prophecy is God's heart, mind, will, and intent. And if you're more focused about God and how He feels about things, you will be disciplined in what you say. You wouldn't want to release a false word in a million years. You wouldn't want to do anything that misrepresents His heart. Second thing about prophetic performance. What did you come out to see? People right now are tired of what's going on. They're tired of the current situation. None of us thought that it would go this long. And if they're not careful, they will want the prophet to perform. They will expect the prophet to perform. Well, wait a minute. You prophesied before the 2020 election, right, that President Trump would be reelected. It hasn't. And you didn't prophesy about all this other stuff. I can just hear people saying that. And so they demand, prophesy. When? How come? And if they're not careful, they can shift into a performance mentality and begin to have itching ears. It speaks about teachers, they heap upon themselves teachers because they have itching ears. Well, we can't do that in the prophetic. We have itching ears. We just got to, because when Paul went to Mars Hill in the book of Acts, he said, look, people, you're too superstitious. And we have to be careful in the prophetic community. What Paul said to the people at Mars Hill, who were into occult, they're into the supernatural. He said, look, you're too superstitious. And you're always wanting to hear some new thing or to see it. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be hungry. I'm not saying we shouldn't prophesy, but God said to me, right now, prophets, we need to speak less, pray, and listen more than what we speak. How do we know? I go by unction. And God knows this about me, and I can't speak for other people, but Sid Ross said something to me one time. He said, Hank, you're probably one of the most cautious acting prophets I've ever met. And I said, well, I don't know if that's a compliment, Sid. I don't know if you're trying to say you wish I would say more, and that's not an indictment against Sid. It's just when he said it to me, I'm like, I don't care who the person is. If I don't feel it, or just because somebody wants to increase their ratings, it's not going to be at my expense. I'm going to hold on to the word of the Lord and make sure that God wants me to say it. So I go by unction, and most of the time, unless I feel that continual, how do I say, it's almost like what Kenneth Hagin used to teach, that constant feeling on the inside of you that God is pushing on you saying, come on, release it, release it. There's times where I stand up in the moment. We have people say, well, all prophecies need to be submitted. Well, what do you do when you're under the inspiration of God at that moment and God is pressing you to speak? Because, Steve, I've had angels show up in my church with scrolls that I've read, and then 4 days later, it's all over the news. And at that moment, I have to obey. So I've learned how to yield to that. And my goal is not to release a word. My goal is to wait upon the one whose heart means more to me than anyone. And if he wants to say something, then I let him come upon me. And there's certain ways. Listen, I've been married to my beautiful wife, Brenda, for 33 years. I can tell when she enters into a room. I can tell when God comes into the room. I was just with Kat Kerr at a meeting. I was preaching. I literally saw a figure come off to my left side with a beard and a robe, and I literally realized as it went behind me, it was Jesus. And Kat was in the audience, and she starts pointing up, going, Jesus is here. And I said, Jesus is here. And I got on my knees, and the whole place started getting before the Lord. And Kat said, the Lord said, I have come to validate every word that this man is speaking regarding this vessel here. And so I've learned I've learned his presence. And that doesn't come by just releasing everything that comes out of your mouth. It's almost better to be more cautious than it is to not be cautious. Now, in the cautiousness that I have and the desire not to miss it, because every true prophet does not want to miss it.
Right.
Okay? That's why don't be so quick to accuse them, throw stones at them. Kim Clement said something to me one time when he called me. He said, Hank, he said, you are called to a grace that he carried. And I said, what grace is that, Kim? He said, it's not just a grace, Hank, it's a spiritual assignment. And I said, well, what is that, Kim? He said, you are called, Hank, to prophesy risky prophecies. And I said, well, what should I do? He said, learn to spend most of your time listening than speaking. Because if you listen, you will already start getting the feel of what God is going to say. And then when the unction comes on you, you will know, hey, I've already kind of felt that. I've already kind of heard it. God's already been dealing with me on that. Now's the time to release it. And it'll discipline you.